Welcome to the first MuniSquare Book Podcast. We chose Paul Bloom's Against Empathy because the questions he raises are as provocative today as when the book was first published in 2016. Bloom is a psychologist known for his work on morality, empathy, and human development. He taught at Yale for more than 2 decades and now teaches at the University of Toronto. His research explores how we make moral decisions, how compassion develops, and how emotions influence ethical life. He asks, echoing Adam Smith's foundational question in the theory of moral sentiments, whether we are capable of placing ourselves in another's situation and becoming, in some measure, the same person, or at least not altogether unlike him. But Bloom argues that emotional empathy can mislead us. It favors bias, overvalues the familiar, and can even open us up to manipulation. Instead, he urges us to consider a framework of rational compassion, a more consistent and thoughtful moral approach that helps us care without being overwhelmed. In short, Bloom challenges our assumptions, and we're here to take him up on that conversation. Today, MuniSquare colleagues Tom Breyer, Mike Rowe, Matt Canlin, and Mandy Cantlin wrestle with the questions Bloom raises. From political violence to the ethics of neutrality in public service, we explore whether empathy is always good, or whether it sometimes leads us astray. Read more about MuniSquare and our contributors in the show notes, and if you're not yet a subscriber, we invite you to subscribe and join us in exploring how local governance shapes our world. Thanks for being here. Now Tom's going to start us off.
All right. So Paul Bloom in the book Against Empathy makes a provocative argument. He plainly states he is against empathy. Not empathy in all forms, not empathy as it might universally be understood or commonly used as an idea, but he is against empathy because it can lead to the opposite of what we might intend as a society when we encourage more empathetic behavior. Expressing or showing empathy or trying to feel what others might feel or what we think others might feel actually has potentially perverse effect of leading us as individuals and as societies to express favoritism, to create in-groups and out-groups, to privilege some over others. What he argues is that an emotional kind of empathy where we try to feel what others are feeling is actually bad for society. Cognitive empathy, on the other hand, is something that might be good for society. It allows us to think compassionately with reason and rationality about situations others in our life around the world might be experiencing. We need to try to understand those experiences without trying to feel those experiences so we don't create a deeper emotional attachment than is warranted by the situation. So I kind of want to start there. The broad theme of Bloom's text is against empathy. He is very clear in the early pages. He says, I am against empathy because empathy is potentially bad for society. It has negative implications, negative outcomes associated with it. What do you all think? Is empathy always good as those who kind of talk about empathy these days, particularly in light of current events associated with the shooting and assassination of Charlie Kirk? There's a call for greater civility, discourse, empathy to heal the wounds that are manifest right now. So that's a suggestion. Empathy is good. Is it? Or is Paul Bloom empathy is really a bad thing and leads to negative consequences? Or does it depend? What do you think?
The first thing I would mention is, just as a critique of the writing, by the time I got to the last page, I came to the conclusion this really should have been a pamphlet. There's a lot of filler in there. I was a little bit let down at the end. I thought, boy, all of that when you could have just summarized all of it in a much shorter form. But he does raise an interesting issue worth talking about. I think what I came from Tom was he wasn't necessarily saying, and he didn't say it this way, I'm saying it this way. I think it was more of the degree of empathy. Empathy is one thing, and this is the age-old head and heart conversation, but the degree of empathy needs to be gauged. You can't go all in with heart or all in with head, although he was kind of suggesting you go mostly in with head. That was what I came across with, was the degree of empathy can be bad. Too much empathy without reason can be a bad thing. The other thing I would point out was that implied in a lot of what he talked about was empathy needs to be tethered to something. The feeling without some sort of moral basis, I think, can be problematic. He gave some examples of empathy that can go wrong, but I would argue that it wasn't the empathy that went wrong. It was what it was tethered to, the worldview or the moral basis of that empathy. So those are just my initial thoughts.
I agree on the length of the book. I think there was a lot of circularity in it at times, but the point that Tom's neatly summarized is a useful one to discuss. For me, I think there's a kind of false assumption, which is that empathy is bad because we act upon it, but we don't necessarily. It's not something we always act upon. I feel I probably frustrate myself quite a lot by not acting on empathy because I feel powerless to do. So for me, empathy is not the problem. Simply acting on empathy alone, and that's maybe the lack of tether you referred to, Matt, is potentially a problem. Because as Tom referred to, lead to biases and so forth, and certainly a kind of tunnel vision at times. But I think there's a problem with that separation of head and heart, as if these are separate entities. It's a very Cartesian understanding of how we as humans think and see the world. I think we know from a lot of work done about things like synesthesia, you cannot separate the senses from the way we interpret and see the world. This separation of heart from the empathy from rationality, I think, is misleading and unhelpful way of thinking about how we as humans make decisions and interpret the world around us.
Yeah, in kind of defense of Bloom and the idea that the book could have been a pamphlet, he does acknowledge that every chapter can be read as a separate essay, that he encourages everybody to read everything, but every chapter can be read on its own merit, on its own terms. Maybe it could have been a series of essays, and perhaps it started in this way. But that's the defense. I'm empathizing with Bloom there a little. I'm feeling what he may have been feeling, thinking what he may have been thinking. Can I push a little bit on this point of action or the tether? The idea that it's a false assumption that empathy is always acted upon. The inaction might be seen as a kind of action as well, right? Choosing to act on empathy or feeling powerless to act on empathy is quite a big statement. What makes someone feel powerless? Can we separate the two? If we feel emotionally connected to their hurt or experiences of another person, but feel powerless to assist them, what does that say about the power of empathy? Maybe good and bad is not the way to think about it. Is it that important as a motivator for action in the context of a society that might not encourage individual agency, that might not encourage individual activism? What do you think? Is there a bigger story here than that's good or bad empathy, or that's linked to this idea of action and inaction and the powerlessness we might have as individuals to act on empathy?
I think for me, powerlessness element is that I can feel empathy for people in flight. Their home is going to be underwater in a matter of months because of climate change. But what can I actually do to help in that circumstances? It is a frustrating thing because there is an element of individual powerlessness in that context. Not least, there might be millions or thousands of miles away. I can do something which doesn't respond to the empathetic thing. It's a more pragmatic thing, which is to either become an activist in some environmental cause or maybe donating to some worthy activity that might be directly assisting those people or otherwise. It's not complete powerlessness, but that story doesn't lead simply to action and response. It leads to something else.
Can I add to that a little bit?
Please.
Yeah, I agree with Mike on that. It gets to one of my frustrations with the book. There's a lot that I got out of it, and I'm happy to share that as we go. But one of the frustrations was that empathy is so complex and intertwined with other emotions. I find it hard to tease it out and focus on it alone. It's just one of many influences we base our actions on. Whether we choose to act on something or don't act on something, I find it challenging to zero that down to empathy as just one component of it. This is going down a little bit of a rabbit hole, but I think there's also, for us on the public leader side of things, I think there's a difference is what I would act on as an tool and what I would act on as a policy leader too.
Can you expand on that a little bit more? What are those different hats, and how do you, maybe separating the head from the heart, if you have a sense of empathy around a person, around a situation, how do you act differently wearing a public servant hat compared to your individual citizen hat?
For me, I feel much more free to act on what my individual head or heart might feel about a certain situation or a certain person, because I'm really making that decision for myself, whether it's making a choice to donate to a certain cause or to help an individual in a certain situation or a group in a certain situation. When I wear the public servant hat or a public leadership hat, I'm making decisions that are for the public good or attempting to make decisions that are for the public good. It's very difficult to find a public decision that doesn't have negative and positive impacts. And that's where, getting back to what Matt said earlier, balancing the head in and balancing that with your decisions with hard data and balancing what your heart might feel. I think that's a different type of decision-making path, and it's a different approach to a decision. What I do individually might be very different than what I do for the public good.
And that perhaps connects to that kind of idea of neutrality almost, isn't it? In terms of, as a public servant, your personal motivations might be something you have to suppress in terms of your public role.
I think that's where some of our political debates come in too, where we have citizens that believe the government should be stepping forward to do certain things. What should the public be doing? What should the government be doing? You'll see the dividing line between arguments that the government should be doing more in the interest of humanity or social good, and others being more interested in having a secure nation. I think that's the dividing line of what should the government be doing versus what should individuals be doing.
And I think it's a good point, because this is what I was getting to when I talked about what is empathy tethered to? What is it connected to? He doesn't make exactly the point I'm making, I don't think, but he uses some examples. So for example, take abortion. You could have two very empathetic people approach that issue and come to completely different conclusions. What are they tethering it to? What is the principle, the guiding principle they're using, the filter through which they view that issue? So the empathy almost becomes like a tool, a vehicle, and it's carrying that worldview. You could use the same thing Mandy was saying. This is why so many of our debates, well, the shooter of Charlie Kirk, based on reports I've heard, he empathetically looked at what Charlie Kirk was saying as that was being very damaging and harmful and maybe even violent to a group of people. So you can hardly say through empathy, he felt like he had to take action. I think it's not the empathy that's the problem. It's what it's tethered to, the lens through which you're using empathy.
Right. So that's an interesting example, of course, and we can move that into a lot of different directions to continue the conversation. But I want to reflect on one example that Bloom did use in the book, and that goes back to the War on Terror. That shows the age of the book. It was published quite a number of years ago, but the arguments are still very much relevant. To the credit of Bloom for raising these issues that are still very timely for us today, the example he gave was from Dick Cheney. During the War on Terror, there was some fierce debate around the world around whether it's appropriate or not to torture or use torture on prisoners to extract information related to terrorist cells or terrorist organizations, threats, active threats, or possible threats to the security of the nation or the world. Part of the argument against torture was this idea of empathy. If we're empathetic, then we should care about how people feel in a position of possibly being tortured. Dick Cheney, I'm paraphrasing here, said something along the lines of, well, I don't lack empathy. Instead, my empathy is with those people who received phone calls from loved ones as they were on the plane that was about to crash into a field in Pennsylvania, or they were on the plane that crashed into the Pentagon, or they were in the tower that was about to collapse and they were making their last phone calls. My empathy is with the victims and with the families of the victims, not with the terrorists, to paraphrase Cheney. The point there is, maybe it's a tethering piece, is the value judgment, right? Who is the beneficiary, if I can use that word, of our empathy. That's where debate happens, the values judgment. There's no universal notion that one person or one type of person is deserving of empathy, whereas another type of person is not deserving of empathy. But this is how it plays out in our politics and our policy discussions in the minds of citizens. We order or sequence who's deserving and who's not deserving. Do you agree with that? Who's deserving and who's not deserving? Do you agree with that kind of summary?
I'd connect that to the Willie Horton case that also gets a mention in the book in terms of where empathy should not be driving public policy in that context. It's not a question of empathy that should lead to a decision about how one responds to terrorism, etc. It's a much more complicated thing than to respond on that basis. I don't think anybody took decisions on the basis simply of empathy. So it's kind of an example of there's kind of false argument about it almost. In the Willie Horton case, it was manipulated, empathy was manipulated. And yes, in that sense, you can argue that empathy is a problem, but it's a manipulation of empathy by politicians who know exactly what they're doing. That's perhaps more of the problem in that context.
And that seems to be the major critique against empathy, right? Is that emotions can be manipulated and can sway public opinion, which would stand with Bloom's argument that if emotion can be so easily manipulated, then those in positions of power can drive public opinion and support in one direction or another, perhaps in ways that are not in the long-term interests of a society or that are grounded in the values that keep societies cohesive.
Which is one of the things I objected to, is that focus on empathy. We can use empathy to manipulate feelings. We can also use anger to manipulate feelings and fear to manipulate feelings. I think we risk making bad decisions on the basis of all of that. So I think it's unfair to focus just on one of those emotional tools or reactions. Circling back to, Tom, what you had started with on this value idea, that was one of the things I found myself remembering from Monica Guzman's I Never Thought of It That Way as I was reading the empathy book. It was through her that I learned of Schwartz value systems. I really don't know anything about it. I just remember her referencing that as this list of, I forget how many, maybe 10 values that we all have pieces of, and we just prioritize which ones are most important to us, whether it's power or benevolence or tradition or a whole bunch of others. And I think it's, we're looking at judging whether an action is good or bad through the lens of the values that we were in part, I don't know, to the extent we're born with them, that we develop them as we grow up. But that's where our judgment comes from. Yeah, somebody is going to look at an act through their individual lens and think of something as good, another one bad. And I think abortion that Matt raised is a good example of that.
Matt, did you want to jump in?
You mentioned something about the manipulation of empathy, which I think is really an interesting point. I went back to his example in the book where he talks about the warlords in Sierra Leone and how I guess I didn't get the whole story, but I guess apparently as part of their promotional thing, they show little children with like limbs cut off and stuff, and that makes people more empathetic or sympathetic, and they donate more money. He said, well, we do it for you so that you'll send us more money. That's a really extreme example. The more mild example, which I think all of us can relate to, are the State of the Union addresses. And I think it started with Reagan. I think he was the first one that did it, but now they're becoming increasingly masterful of it, where you cart in these figures that you just play on people's emotions and their sympathies. And here he is in the stand, or here she is in the stand. And you can give all these examples, but that's a manipulation. At one point, I wish he had emphasized a little bit more, is that a world without reason is a disaster, but also a world without empathy is too. And I think he tries to make that point. You need to have the balance. I just think about some of the manipulations, and the modern world is full of it. I mean, you think of all the examples of how we manipulate empathy. I think that's maybe one of the points I wish he would have emphasized more, is how it's manipulated.
So Matt, what do you think? The State of the Union practice or the fundraising appeals from various nonprofit organizations, philanthropies, dealing with world hunger, animal suffering, environmental degradation, whatever it might be, we're bombarded with these emotional appeals on a regular basis. And oftentimes they're accompanied by fact as well, right? It's an emotional appeal, and here are the data, if we trust the data, that tell us why this is a problem or why the program we are using is working. And since we're going to pull at your emotional heartstring here and get you to give us some money because we know data won't convince you on its own. But what do you think? Is it a good practice, or is there room to be critical of the use of these emotional appeals ranging from State of the Union to charity organization?
Well, it's clearly very effective. I mean, I still remember years ago, a commercial came on late night. Remember all the things used to come on late at night? I think it was called Christian Children's Fund. And they showed these children in faraway places in horrible conditions. They made it so easy for you to contribute. But if you were looking at things rationally, say, okay, I can give to that, and it appears to be a good cause, and assuming this Christian Children's Fund is a legitimate organization, what about some of the folks right down the street that don't necessarily have a handler that can play on your sympathies? In some ways, it's very effective, extremely effective, but I guess it does kind of create the bias that Bloom was talking about. Whether it's a close-up bias or faraway bias, when you're manipulating people's empathy, you can create bias. Maybe that's not exactly the way he was explaining it, but I think empathy can really be weaponized in that regard and sometimes create good outcomes and bad outcomes depending on who's doing the manipulating.
Is this for just getting away from relying upon people giving charitably in order to respond to serious issues? Is this an argument for big government then?
Well, not what the argument I was making, but I think it's getting back to the balance that having a good balance of reason and a good balance of empathy makes a healthy human and makes a healthy society. When those things get out of balance, I always look at it, and it's kind of like the mom and dad stereotype. Dad is the reason, mom is the empathy. Both of those together blend to make this wonderful kind of balanced child that grows up and is a good, well-adjusted person. And I do believe that the balance of reason and empathy really is a wonderful combination. I think he downplays empathy a little bit too much, but anyway, that's what I was trying to get. I think that the blending of the two is really a wonderful thing.
I think the big government provocation, from my perspective, was something I was finding throughout the book. If individual responses to situations can be manipulated, can lead to poor decisions, should we just hand it over to big government to be making decisions about which social injustices or problems or issues we collectively deal with on a rational basis?
Mike, who makes up government? It's people. So, I mean, you have the same problem, whether it's, the government isn't necessarily like some objective third party. It's made up of people, and they can be manipulated just as much as anyone else can.
There's a little bit more robustness to it. Or is it at least an electoral system? Is it some opportunity for challenge and for debate?
Yeah, I don't know. Mandy, what's the old famous saying? Would you get better government from the current elected officials, or if you just took the first 8 people out of the phone book?
I know exactly what you're referring to. I think this is the crux of the issue, or one of the issues. Matt, I shared your thought process that I too thought of the State of the Union addresses and how they use individual cases to highlight public policy. I think that's the spotlight that Bloom talks about. This is where the issue potentially comes in, where you're taking an individual emotion and reaction to a story, to a case study, and pushing it into the public policy realm and saying the government is now making choices based on that. Some would argue that that's causing the government to expand to a size that is not sustainable, nor desirable, nor reflecting the opinions of all individuals. Government is made up of the people. Different groups do not see the government acting in their best interest when they make decisions that I think Bloom would say are based on empathy. Whether they are or not, I don't know. But I think is a great example of the potential manipulation and the spotlighting effect he is talking about.
I'm wondering about the difference between manipulation and education. Perhaps there's a fine line. We can talk about cognitive empathy, which Bloom does, the rational-based empathy. There's certainly the education piece of that. I wonder if there's such a thing of an educating the heart, if you will, and that perhaps we were cynically seeing things as manipulation that are really just honest efforts to educate, but educate the heart, educate the feeling, not just the mind, about the realities of the world. And I'm thinking, as we talk, contribute $15 a month to UNICEF USA for a program. It's a direct benefit program where every month they send to my 5-year-old son a Paddington bear. Where in the world is Paddington, with a postcard and a profile of a child in that part of the world. It's a way to showcase what is happening in that part of the world, the unique challenges and life circumstances of this child in that part of the world. And I want to go back and read some of these again, because I'm thinking, is my son being manipulated or is my son being educated? Right? Because there's probably a little bit of both that's happening. I'm curious if there's any, we're approaching the idea here as emotional pulling on the heartstrings. This is kind of channeling Bloom, I suppose, as well, as a negative, that it has negative repercussions for policy and practice. But is it a good thing? Are we actually educating people by pulling at their heartstrings? Are we getting them to think about the facts, to think about the data, to explore the broader picture? Thus, empathy is a gateway to greater enlightenment, if you will.
Have any of you ever heard of the Carlisle Indian School?
Okay.
This was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. I was actually the borough manager there for a number of years. What made me think about this? This illustrates the idea of educating people and trying to, and this gets to my point about empathy being tethered to something. The idea behind the Carlisle Indian School started in the late 1800s, where I forget the guy's name that started it, but he was going to bring young Native American kids to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and he was going to teach them how to live in American society. Okay. And that would mean he'd come and essentially try and get them away from their old culture and try and inculcate into them these new cultural norms and values that he thinks would help them be successful. Okay. Well, today this is considered a disaster. Okay. The local newspapers in Carlisle every couple of years have articles about how Native American groups in Oklahoma or Tulsa want to bring these kids back that were buried there, and how horrible it is. And so it comes back to this issue of tethering. Empathy itself is, in my mind, isn't necessarily the good or the bad. It's what it's connected to.
And that actually adds another layer. We've talked about looking at these actions and decisions through the lens of values, but we can also look at it through the lens of time. Some of the things that as a society we deemed good at one point in time, decades later, we see as bad. And that's going to continue to happen too. So I think that's another layer that we have to look at things through. Just kind of, Tom, back to what you said, I think when we talk about this linking between education and emotion in general, two of the challenges we have is, one, there's a certain responsibility of the receiver, the person doing the feeling, the empathizing, the learning, to realize that any of these tools can be used to manipulate and really start to be curious and start to critique how they're absorbing all of this messaging and not just take it at face value or stop at the emotional level, to really challenge themselves to look at a broader picture. And then in that same vein, the media also plays a role in that, in how they're framing their stories and in who their audience is. If we as consumers spend all of our time within a certain silo, getting our messaging from a certain group of sources, we're going to have different values that we're going to be looking at all of these actions through. So just two additional challenges.
I think I'd come back on some of this as well, but I have to say you can be manipulated just as much by rationality. There is no one answer, which rationality can sometimes imply. It is marshalling of evidence, perhaps. That can be done in a particular way. The analysis undertaken with whatever evidence you have can be done in very different ways. So let's not play up rationality, and remember that rationality and empathy and emotions more generally are connected. They're not separate. We analyze things with our emotional brain. The brain is not separate from our emotions, I would say.
But it is a framework. I mean, looking at something from a rational perspective is different than looking at it from an emotional perspective. But one of the things I
don't think it is, to be honest. I don't think it is, because what you mean by rationality is probably different to what I mean by it. And that's partly, well, that's a number of factors, but it's not that rationality is not something objective and neutral.
Well, we use certain tools for rationality. You use logic.
It's curious to use certain tools and not others.
Yeah. So that's what I mean. When you're looking at something rationally, one of the tools you're using is logic. You're not necessarily using logic when you're looking at something emotionally.
We talk about the idea of bounded rationality, that we don't have complete information to be fully informed to make the best judgment about a situation because we're missing some part of the picture, and we usually don't know what part of the picture we're missing from the rational perspective. But perhaps we can talk in the same way about bounded emotionality. We feel some sense of what others might be feeling, what we think they are feeling, but we have no idea what is being felt across the spectrum of values, complexity, and nuance that make up each person in society. So we're dealing with bounded rationality, bounded emotionality, and that renders us in a position of ultimately muddling through, trying not to do harm to each other and not trying to do harm to the broader society. It justifies pluralism, right? You let the arguments happen, let everybody use the tools that they have at their disposal, and may the best argument win.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mike.
I think we're very often not fully aware of our own personal emotional reaction, let alone being able to put ourselves fully into the shoes of somebody else, for certain. Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. I suppose that one of the reasons he wrote this book was in response to the growing trend of empathetic leadership and emotional intelligence. What in the early 2000s kind of grew. And I guess it was essentially suggesting that there was a deficiency in that. So if you need more emotional intelligence, if you need more empathetic leadership, that suggests that you didn't have it before. So all these books would come out, Emotional Intelligence 1.0 and Emotional Intelligence 2.0. And I find it fascinating. What changed? Why did we suddenly become interested in empathetic leadership and emotional? I have my theories, but I think that's what he's kind of trying to attack, is that we're really starting to emphasize, maybe a bit too much, the need and the benefits of empathy. What do you think?
Yeah, and authenticity is a more recent kind of model of it as well. I try not to read them, if I'm honest. It's a whole life's career dedicated to it. But yeah, I think you could be very right in that. It was certainly a fashion of 10 to 15 years ago, maybe.
But the idea of empathy is very much present, and we've danced around a little bit. The Charlie Kirk shooting addressed that directly. He said a lot of the calls happening right now are for not only greater civility, but more empathy. If we want to reduce the threat or the actual occurrence of political violence, we need to do a better job of empathizing, at the very least understanding each other, or at the very least not demonizing each other. And that requires some level of either understanding the life experiences of others around us, if not directly putting ourselves in the shoes of other people so that we can feel what other people are actually feeling. Do you see that? Maybe this is a good place to close. Mandy, I know you got to jump soon, so we can, if I can put you on the hot seat here to answer the question first. What do you think? Is empathy one of the tools, one of the many influences, as you referred to them before, that can see us out of this dark place we're in as a society where political violence is increasingly prominent and seen as a viable option for some within the society to resolve differences?
Yeah, I think it can be. But I think that we can't be selective in how we choose to apply our empathy. I may not have agreed with Charlie Kirk's platform, but I can't let that get in the way of me trying to at least appreciate the value set that he had and where he was coming from. I'm not saying that I'm trying to agree with him. I'm just saying that he obviously felt strongly. His value system had different prioritizations than mine, which led him to pursue his path, something he felt very passionate about. In pursuing that path, he raised his risk level. Anytime any of us are moving into the public realm, whether it's as a celebrity legislator or just somebody taking a very strong position, we raise the focus on ourselves. There are going to be people that agree with us and disagree with us, and that raises our risk. I think he knew that. But I guess how I would apply empathy in this situation is, I think what happened to him was wrong. I think the impacts it's having are wrong. I don't think it's ever right to take somebody's life because you don't believe their value system. I think there's probably things I could bridge with him if I look at the world through his eyes, or at least try to see the concerns that he has. to answer your question, I think that's where it can be a tool. We just can't be selective with it and only choose to use it as a tool when we agree with somebody and not choose to use it as a tool when we don't agree with somebody.
Right. And Matt, I think you said earlier that the shooter in this case, Tyler Robinson, it was empathy that led him to see committing this act of violence as a necessary pathway. Empathy may have been the root of the problem. Do you see empathy as a solution to get us out of this politically violent society?
Well, I think we'll pull a couple ideas that we talked about together in this example, both the manipulation of empathy and, well, let me mention that first. My guess is we're going to find out this young man, if he is the one that did all this, which seems apparent, that he probably wasn't as emotionally stable as your average person. And so maybe he's easier to manipulate than others. The empathy was manipulated, and maybe his rationality wasn't, mentally he wasn't where he should have been. I think that's what people have been saying and what he was kind of saying. From what I read, he's so hateful. You think of your worst character you can think of. That's where I think it was manipulated and tethered inappropriately. What he did was horrible. But if you kind of play through this thought process, if this, then that, you can see how in his mind he thinks maybe it's a rational thing to do. I'm helping the world. I'm saving the world from a very hateful person that could hurt it.
So given that empathy is possibly a root of the political violence, is empathy also a pathway out of the political violence?
Yeah, I also happen to think that this is the first time in world history where you have a pluralistic society based on freedom. In other words, we're not forced to be together like Rome or the Soviet Union. We're trying to figure out how to get along with each other. I firmly believe there's certain ideas that can't coexist. The classic one in my mind is the Declaration of Independence and slavery. All men are created equal. Yeah, we have slavery. Those two can't coexist long. And of course, we had a civil war over it. So I think we're wrestling with some ideas that I don't think can really coexist with each other. And some of these ideas are going to win out over other ideas. I'm not so sure empathy is going to solve this. I think certain ideas have just got to be, people can be persuaded, and certain ideas are going to win out over other ideas.
Mike, thoughts?
I hesitate to comment. I must admit, it's not something I've followed with any close attention. I guess there is no argument for an act of political violence. There is no rationalizing, there's no empathy that justifies it. Is empathy a way out? It's part of it, certainly, I would think. Having said that, I would struggle at times to empathize with some people engaged in public debates at the moment. Because it's hard to empathize with somebody who clearly has no time for you and your opinions. And this is on all sides. I'm not pointing fingers at anybody at this point. And it's going on in the UK as well in different contexts. It's very hard to retain a sense that other people's opinions are worth listening to when they're expressed in ways that are personally offensive to you.
That's the challenge of civility as well. The conversation now is that empathy and civility are good bedfellows. They must go together, feed on each other, support each other, and produce positive outcomes related to empathy, avoiding the negative. If we bring people together in civil discourse, we can reduce the extent of bounded emotionality and bounded rationality because we are exposing more people in a civil way without demonizing. We can provide greater social awareness.
Yeah, focusing on what we have in common more than what divides, which is very often at the margins of who we are already.
So maybe to close out, we lost Mandy, but maybe we can each say, do we take the Bloom statement? I am against empathy. That was his statement. Would you say the same thing?
Mine would be a qualified agreement. And I think he makes some good points. It's the degree of empathy and how empathy is used. He makes good points, but I'm not against empathy.
Nor am I. But now this is a great discussion. I think it's really timely. The book, I forget what year the book was published.
2016.
Okay. But still, there's a different era, but it's still highly relevant. The issues he raised are really important. So the book might be written in pamphlet format. There are some arguments worth considering, and I would recommend it for others to read, certainly. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.